Infantry is an army specialization whose personnel engage in military combat on foot. Distinguished from cavalry, artillery, and armored forces, also known as foot soldiers, infantrymen or infantia. Infantry traditionally rely on traveling by foot between combats as well, but may also use mounts or aircraft for between combat mobility and logistics. Infantry make up a large portion of all armed forces in most nations, and typically bear the largest brunt in warfare, as measured by casualties, discomfort, fatigue, and both physical and psychological stress. The first military forces in history were infantry. In antiquity, infantry were armed with early melee weapons such as a spear, axe, or sword, or an early ranged weapon like a javelin, sling, or bow, with a few infantrymen having both a melee and a ranged weapon. With the development of gunpowder, infantry began converting to primarily firearms. By the time of Napoleonic warfare, infantry, cavalry and artillery formed a basic triad of ground forces, though infantry usually remained the most numerous. With armored warfare, armored fighting vehicles have replaced the horses of cavalry, and air power has added a new dimension to ground combat. But infantry remains pivotal to all modern combined arms operations. Infantry have much greater local situational awareness than other military forces, due to their inherent intimate contact with the battlefield or via air assault by helicopters. They can be augmented with a variety of crew-served weapons, armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles. In English, use of the term infantry began about the 1570s. Describing soldiers who march and fight on foot. The word derives from Middle French infanterie, from Older Italian, from which English also gets infant. The individual soldier term infantryman was not coined until 1837. In modern usage, foot soldiers of any era are now considered infantry and infantrymen. From the mid-18th century until 1881, the British Army named its infantry as numbered regiments of foot, to distinguish them from cavalry and dragoon regiments. Infantry equipped with special weapons were often named after that weapon, such as grenadiers for their grenades, or fusiliers for their fusils. These names can persist long after the weapon's speciality. Examples of infantry units that retained such names are the Royal Irish Fusiliers and the Grenadier Guards. More commonly in modern times, infantry with special tactics are named for their roles, such as commandos, rangers, snipers, marines, and militia. They are still infantry due to their expectation to fight as infantry when they enter combat. Dragoons were created as mounted infantry, with horses for travel between battles. They were still considered infantry since they dismounted before combat. However, if light cavalry was lacking in an army, any available dragoons might be assigned their duties. This practice increased over time, and dragoons eventually received all the weapons and training as both infantry and cavalry, and could be classified as both. Conversely, starting about the mid-19th century, regular cavalry have been forced to spend more of their time dismounted in combat due to the ever-increasing effectiveness of enemy infantry firearms. Thus most cavalry transitioned to mounted infantry. As with grenadiers, the dragoon and cavalry designations can be retained long after their horses, such as in the Royal Dragoon Guards, Royal Lancers, and King's Royal Hussars. Similarly, motorized infantry have trucks and other unarmed vehicles for non-combat movement, but are still infantry since they leave their vehicles for any combat. Most modern infantry have vehicle transport, to the point where infantry being motorized is generally assumed, and the few exceptions might be identified as modern light infantry, or leg infantry, colloquially. Mechanized infantry go beyond motorized, having transport vehicles with combat abilities, armored personnel carriers, providing at least some options for combat without leaving their vehicles. In modern infantry, some APCs have evolved to be infantry fighting vehicles, which are transport vehicles with more substantial combat abilities, approaching those of light tanks. Some well-equipped mechanized infantry can be designated as armored infantry, given that infantry forces typically also have some tanks, And given that most armored forces have more mechanized infantry units than tank units in their organization, the distinction between mechanized infantry and armor forces has blurred. The terms infantry, armor, and cavalry used in the official names for military units like divisions, brigades, or regiments might be better understood as a description of their expected balance of defensive, offensive, and mobility roles, rather than just use of vehicles. Some modern mechanized infantry units are termed cavalry or armored cavalry, even though they never had horses, to emphasize the